The Long Road by Wolfland. Don't make me the last elite to fall at your hands. With the outright threat lingering, Glacia finally broke eye contact and stepped aside with a graceful curtsy, ushering Steven toward the door. Sparing the prickly elite one last uncertain glance, Steven stepped past her and into a hallway that held the same chill as the previous chamber, but for a very different reason. Administering some of his precious healing items to his Pokémon, he couldn't ignore his growing unease. Even though the hall was well lit, dark shadows hung at the edges of the room, a ghost's playground. This time, Steven did shudder as he neared the chamber door. Both Iona and Glacia had been incredibly skilled and imposing trainers, and yet he had two very different battles against them both. But ghost types were fickle Pokémon that demanded years of experience to train, let alone train well enough to claim a spot in the Elite Four. He pushed the chamber doors wide and squinted through the hanging gloom towards the far side of the battlefield. What sort of opponent would Phoebe prove to be? So when the arena lights clicked on, Steven could only stare in shock. Standing at the elite's position was a thin, dark-skinned teen dressed in a flowing floral print sarong, wearing an expression that told him she was just as shocked to see him as he was to see her. You beat Glacia so quickly! What? Under Steven's incredulous stare, Phoebe fidgeted nervously, bringing one hand up to play with the petals of a pink flower behind her ear. Welcome, Challenger, to your worst nightmare! She finished with a dramatic gesture. Steven narrowed his gaze at her meek attempt to save face, and Phoebe winced at his skeptical look. Look, I'm still not good with this whole intimidating speech thing. Can we just battle? I promise I'm better at battling than looking fierce. Still recovering from the initial shock, Steven found himself nodding until he caught sight of a slight movement behind Phoebe. It was only fleeting, but he swore he saw a shadowy presence flit by. Was it just a trick of the light? Or was Phoebe's meek presence hiding something more sinister? She was part of the Elite Four, after all. There was no way she could be as innocent as she appeared to be. Great! She chimed, grabbing her first Pokeball with a cheery smile. Let's get started! Or maybe she really was. Chapter 16, Terminus, Part 2. Her Dusclops hit the ground with more of a thud than any ghost had a right to. Steven's eyes narrowed. If her first Pokemon was a heavy hitter, then his would be too. Armaldo, it's your turn! The more offensive-minded of his two fossil Pokemon also shook the earth as it materialized on the battlefield with a trill. Its fins stood on end as its gaze landed on the bandage-wrapped ghost that stared back with one unblinking eye. Ready? Asked Phoebe, face alight with anticipation. Steven nodded again, staring hard at the overly cheerful elite. There had to be some trick afoot. But when Dusclops opened with a standard-looking Shadow Punch, which Armaldo neatly dodged, the battle appeared fairly normal. As the large mummy-like Pokemon followed through on its next punch, Armaldo sidestepped around the blow and perked up at Steven's command. X-Scissor! Crossed claws came down on Dusclops' back, and the sound of ripping fabric filled the air, mixed with a hiss of pain as it stumbled from Armaldo's strike. One massive hand clamped down on the open wound, dark mist seeping out from between its fingers as its single eye slid to where Armaldo stood frozen in wide-eyed terror. Steven, too, paled at what his Pokemon had seen. The slicing attack had torn away some of the graying bandages that wound around Dusclops' body, but instead of something tangible beneath the cloth, there was nothing but emptiness. Taking advantage of the stunned silence, Dusclops fixed Armaldo with a leering stare, and Armaldo shivered under its gaze. The fence lowered. The follow-up Shadow Punch that caught Armaldo's midsection sent the prehistoric Pokemon tumbling. With its foe momentarily dispatched, Dusclops balled its hand into a fist, crumpling bandages over its wound and effectively sealing the hole. Armaldo struggled back to its feet, one claw gingerly protecting where the ghostly energy lingered from the blow, and Steven frowned as he spotted a small smirk on Phoebe's lips. He couldn't simply trade blows and hope to come out on top. Her Dusclops could hit hard. "We need speed," he muttered, before throwing a hand outward. "Armaldo, use Rock Polish!" In the same moment, Phoebe also issued her next command. "Future Sight!" Both Pokemon sprang into action on their respective sides of the battlefield, Armaldo crouching low and polishing his wings, while Dusclops' palms raised up toward the ceiling as its eye rolled back in its socket, a psychic aura hanging heavy above its head. Steven tensed as he watched this psychic attack form. Future Sight was a slow-building move. If Armaldo could finish its speed boost early, they could strike while Dusclops was defenseless. Just as the thought crossed his mind, Armaldo grunted confirmation that it was ready. "Go! X-Scissor now while it's vulnerable!" With a sharp cry, Armaldo shot across the battlefield, claws raised at the still motionless ghost type. But Phoebe was ready. "Dusclops! Earthquake!" Its single eye rolled back forward at its trainer's command, and Dusclops raised a stocky leg before slamming it into the arena floor. The shockwave rocketed away from the stomp, and Steven jolted forward in his trainer's box from his desperate shout. "Jump!" On high alert, Armaldo's powerful tail instantly snapped down against the ground and sent him skyward. Steven stumbled from the force of the earthquake, but he allowed himself a small grin as his Pokemon's forward momentum vaulted it up and over the deadly attack. Phoebe too watched in amazement and whispered, "Whoa!" as the armored Pokemon gracefully arced over Dusclops' head before landing on its feet with a heavy thud. But the evasive maneuver was only part of Steven's plan. Aerial Ace! Spinning on its heel, Armaldo launched itself back at Dusclops in one smooth motion, nearly vanishing in a white blur of light. "Oh no you don't!" Phoebe's cheeks puffed out in indignation. "Catch it, Dusclops!" Shadowy energy swirled in Dusclops' palms as they turned outward just in time to stop Armaldo's charge. But the white light of Armaldo's attack didn't fade as it slammed full force into Dusclops' defense. Stalemated, both Pokemon dug deep as they shoved back and forth, trying to topple the other, grunting with effort. Slowly, Dusclops struggled to turn and fix Armaldo with another leering stare. Armaldo's once determined grimace faltered, and it wobbled momentarily, giving Dusclops room to shove back, forcing Armaldo to one knee. Hand on his chin as he watched, Steven frowned. Wait a minute. His eyes widened in realization. "Armaldo, get out of there!" At his shout, his partner's gaze snapped over Dusclops' shoulder to find its trainer's panicked stare just as its fins twitched skyward in alarm. Shimmering psychic energy split the air above both combatants, and Future Sight's delayed attack finally rained down all around. Yanking backwards from Dusclops' grip, Armaldo threw itself free of Future Sight's range with a leaping dive. As dust and silence settled across the battlefield, the bubbly tone of Phoebe's giggling floated over the quiet. "Oh, we almost had you too!" Steven watched as Armaldo dragged itself back upright, dusting off its plate armor, before narrowing his gaze at the cheery elite. Was she even taking this battle seriously? "Okay, Dusclops, we'll get them this time! Give it the stare down!" Finding its opponent with another chilling leer, Dusclops closed the distance between them as Armaldo again found itself withering under the ghost's otherworldly stare. "Armaldo!" Steven shouted, hoping to snap his timid partner from its stupor. "Retreat, and let's regroup!" Even though its knees shook and it couldn't tear its gaze away from Dusclops' lone red eye, Armaldo heard Steven shout, and it straightened with a low growl. It wouldn't run away in fear, not with so much at stake. "Armaldo!" Steven called, watching as Dusclops drew closer and closer. Phoebe simply giggled again. "Looks like it's scared stiff. Go, Dusclops!" Shadowy energy gathered around Dusclops' clenched fist as it trudged closer, so close now that its raspy breathing ruffled the fins at Armaldo's neck. But in that instant, Armaldo's stare shifted, and Steven caught the determined glint in its eye. As Dusclops' fist drew back, Steven flung his own skyward. "Do it!" The stone edge exploded beneath Dusclops' feet, skewering the ghost Pokemon on its rocky spires. Darkness spilled from the gaping holes in its cloth bindings, and a horrifying groan gurgled deep from within its body as its fist dropped limp to its side, energy dissipating in a harmless puff. Panting, Armaldo withdrew its foot from where it had driven it into the earth. With a small chime, the first of Phoebe's icons grayed out on the scoreboard, and for the first time, Steven noticed some of the elite's initial nervousness creep back into her expression. "Great job, Armaldo!" He praised his partner as its toothy grin vanished in the recall beam of its Pokeball, and he watched Phoebe do the same. Wordlessly, both trainers selected a new Pokeball from their arsenal and tossed them to begin the second round.